Another potential source of bias or confounds or artifacts, however you want to describe it, is the situation, so the actual environment of the research. This falls under a term called demand characteristics. And essentially, what it is how the environment can shape how people respond. I use the example in the bottom right of a police interrogation room. Notice there are no windows, no clocks, only one way in and out of the room, very bright lighting. All of these are conducive to basically encourage, I don't want to say force, encourage a confession or encourage people to tell the truth. These are demand characteristics. If the police were interviewing a person in the comfort of their own home, they might be more comfortable with not sharing the truth or not fully informing the police of what happened. So this is why that room is so useful. However, in cases of false confessions, it is due to demand characteristics in many cases because that room is so daunting, so intimidating that it can actually essentially be account for the confession in its entirety, right? So when it comes to something like therapy, for example, you want to make sure that you promote a positive environment, right? We want to make sure that we provide awareness, or that we are aware rather, of how the environment could shape how the participants or the client interacts with us, right? So some recommendations, of course, what you want to do is always ahead of time consider the demand characteristics. Can the environment have a potential effect? The answer is almost always yes. How do we minimize that? Some other techniques you might want to consider is ask them afterwards. So, how did you feel about this environment? Did you feel like it contributed or took away from the study? You could also ask them ahead of time. And then also you could see if you could actually use simulators, which essentially allows you to rule out if the environment is actually having a substantial effect on the data. So this one, we're shifting. So previously we were talking about how the researcher or the created research environment can have a problem. Now we're going to talk about the subject a little bit, right? So subjects overall fall into four major categories or roles. There's the good subject, right? In this case, they're compliant to the perceived hypothesis. The good subject is not as good as it sounds, though, because what they're doing is they are telling you what they think you want to hear. This is along the same principle of acquiescence, right? We really don't want that. We want them to be honest with us. Honesty is always going to be what we're searching for in research. The negative subject is even worse. This person is deliberately a contrarian. They're trying to refute what they think you want to hear, which is just so infuriating, right? The faithful subject is the one we love, God bless them. They are the ones that are trying to scientifically avoid bias. They are telling us the truth, regardless of whether or not they think we want to hear it, which is exactly what we want from participants. And then also the apprehensive subject. In this case, the person is really, really guided by social desirability response bias, in that they're trying to make sure that you perceive them in a positive way, that their answers are received positively. Once again, not telling the truth, more concerned about perception. Right? So we want to make sure that we're aware of how these roles can be impact our study, and try and minimize roles that would be negative, right? And encourage honesty in our participants. So how do we address this? Right? We consider which one is most common. Let me throw all these transitions on here. I don't know why I do this. There we go. Apprehensive participants are the most pervasive, most common, right? Why? Because participants get scared. It's kind of a daunting task to be participating in research, particularly if it's in an environment you've never been in, interacting with a person you've never interacted with, maybe even answering questions that are very uncomfortable, right? And it's actually, I would invite you to think about, how it would be if you saw a therapist for the first time, right? At a new environment you've never been in, with a person you've never discussed anything with, sharing, personal information with. Apprehensive, I think, is an obvious response to that. We also want to make sure they know that they're not going to be judged. Once again, like therapy, research needs to be non-judgmental. Encourage them to understand there's no right or wrong answers. And then we can also, in some cases, provide anonymity or confidentiality. So a lot of my research is very, I don't want to say controversial, but they are subject matter that people don't really like to discuss openly. So what I do is I do online surveys so that the participants have both anonymity and confidentiality, so they can know that no matter what they share, it will not be shared with others, right? And then, as we've talked about previously, you want to make sure the participants cannot guess the purpose of what you're doing. So masking the hypothesis as much as possible. This is an excellent idea because the participants, if they can't guess what you're trying to hear, they cannot skew the study in that way or try to skew the study the other way. So when it comes to data recording, I want you to make sure you memorize. I'm not going to ask you to memorize a lot of numbers in this course, but I want you to remember this fact here. Errors in recording are computing approximately 1% of all data points are recorded incorrectly. right? And interestingly enough, they're almost always recorded in favor of the hypothesis, recorded incorrectly in favor of the hypothesis, right? 1%, you might think, oh, who cares? 1%, that means 99% is good, viable data. Yes, but if you're dealing with a data set that has, say, 100,000 pieces of data, which is not uncommon, you're talking about 1,000 pieces of data that are incorrect, right? So it starts to build, and if you look at national data or government data, we're talking about millions of pieces of data, and at that point, we're really getting a lot of erroneous data. What you also might see is what's called limited analysis, where the researcher will only look at a select group of participants because of how they might validate the hypothesis, right? You could also do what's called a file drawer problem, where researchers will not report data because it doesn't further or support their hypothesis. Obviously, that's not what you want to do. We, as scientists, we should be very open, even if the hypothesis we posited wasn't correct. Um, we also occasionally, and this is a cardinal sin of research, if there was an 11th commandment brought down from Mount Sinai, it should say we cannot fudge data, right? We do not fabricate or alter data in any way, or analysis for that matter. This is what we saw in the ethics chapter when we discussed the autism vaccine study, where they deliberately misreported their findings, which has had a long-lasting and widespread impact on people's trust or distrust in vaccines in general. So you cannot, under any circumstance, fudge the data. A good way to go around like this issue of 1% is you can have people respond directly, direct response by the subject, right? So like I said, online surveys are brilliant because they're not telling you anything that you have to record. They are recording their responses directly. So it cuts out the middleman and reduces the chance of error. It doesn't make it go away because obviously they can make an error when they're recording their own response, but it reduces it dramatically. You can always go back and make sure, of course, that all the questions are answered correctly. Check for coding accuracy, including things like range. So if the question is supposed to have an answer range of 1 to 5 and somebody puts 17, you can always go back and check that. You want to make sure you report all results. It's not entirely feasible, right? So when you run a study, for example, when I do a study, I might have 50 questions on the study, but I'm really only concerned about 30 of them that are part of my research. Do I have to report the other 20? Not really, but ideally we would report all the ones that pertain to what we're studying. So it's kind of this slippery slope. You got to be cautious about that. Obviously, and then we have to make sure that our research is replicatable. So we have to provide enough information about how the research was conducted so that it can be replicated by future researchers. The sample. This is a big one. You have to make sure you get a good representative sample. I already used that term in a previous lecture, but make sure you remember this. Representativeness, right? Obviously, a lot of psychological research is reliant on freshmen, college students, right? And they are samples of convenience. I would remember that phrase, samples of convenience, a convenient sample, right? And the problem with that is if you're really only sampling college students, you're getting a demographic group that is very different from the rest of the country, or very unique to the rest of the country. Also, are they really volunteers? If they have to do it for a course, does that make them volunteers? Interestingly enough, if you look at the data on who volunteers for research, volunteers tend to surpass non-volunteers in education, SES, intelligence, sociability, religiosity, altruism, and self-disclosure, which, if you add those all together, it seems like volunteers just tend to be better people, to be honest with you. What does that mean in terms of research? Why do the non-volunteers not volunteer, and what data are we missing from these people who don't volunteer for research? And as a generalization, volunteers tend to be young Jewish women. So we're seeing a specific demographic that seems to volunteer time and time again. So what do we do? By contrast, what we can do instead of a convenient sample, you would get a much more representative sample, a larger spectrum of sampling, better recruiting. So if you think of the last slide, there was a 7-Eleven. Can you get a meal at 7-Eleven? Yes. Is it a bad idea? Yes, right? If you go to Costco, it would take longer, it would cost more, right? But you would have more choices and would be able to generate a better meal having shopped at Costco. That's the idea. You really want to make sure that you look at the sample in its completeness, get good representation so that you can provide good generalizability in your findings. Attrition. I want to make sure you remember that word, by the way. Attrition is a great phrase or a term from research. Basically, it means who drops out, who joins your study and stays, and who drops out of your study. And the problem is attrition, even if it's very small, really has an impact on the validity of the study, right? So your study is no longer random. If you bother to have a random sample and a random assignment, when people drop out, that changes it. It's technically not random anymore. You also can't generalize. to everybody because now you have certain groups that aren't as well represented. And then also too, you can't be as confident about your findings because of a change in construct validity as well as statistical conclusion validity. Right? The question you always want to ask is who stayed and why did they stay? Who left and why did they leave? And it's an important insight because particularly if there are patterns in who left, you really want to know that because you want to know why they did. Why didn't they stick around and provide all their data? So what are some recommendations? Make sure you do some what's called pre-treatment interviews or pre-research interviews. You could also require what's called research deposits. So when I'd research with children, I would say, okay, just for sitting down with me, you can have a sticker. But if you do my whole study, if you answer all my questions, you can have 2 more stickers and you can pick them out. Which, if you know anything about kindergartners, man, stickers are like cigarettes in prison. You can get whatever you need, right? So it allows us to make sure that people are more inclined to stay through the whole duration of the study. But attrition is what it is, and attrition is really not something that you can address too much. You just want to be mindful of it, and then also provide that. Consider that when you're running your analysis later on is, okay, some people left, why did they leave, and what does that mean about the data that I am looking at now? So some things to kind of close and consider. Let me throw all this on here. Why do I do transitions? There we go. So I've got 4 bullet points here. You'll notice that they are very similar in terms of their layout, right? Essentially, I want to make sure that you remember we design, conduct, analyze, and reflect on our research in the same fashion. We need to design research with the mindset of minimizing artifacts and bias. And you can't foresee all of it. As I said, every single study has artifacts or bias or confounds in them. But you can do a very good job in the design part of the study to try and mitigate and reduce the number of biases or artifacts that are brought into the study. As I said, there's only so much you can do, but there's many that can be avoided, and you have to take a moment to think through that. What I would invite you to do is always think about how the research would look if you were a subject. Right? I think sometimes when we read research, we just consider what the results say, right? We don't look at the very granular sort of what would it look like on the ground level, right? Conduct the research. This is super important too because not only do you have to design it well, you have to execute it the way it was planned. It becomes easy, especially when you're running a lot of participants and you have a lot of interviews or a lot of questionnaires to complete. It's easy to kind of start to cut corners and not be as stringent with regard to adhering to the protocols and scripts. But you have to because that's the only way that the data will be accurately generated. Analysis. I actually use the example of you don't want to fish with dynamite. Essentially meaning you can't just look at the data and try and find whatever you want to out of it. You need to have a plan on how it will be analyzed, particularly when you're designing it. And this actually connects all the way to the beginning. You have to have an idea of where you expect to get when you are designing it. I unfortunately had a study that I designed and did not think about the analysis process at all, and essentially had to just throw it away. It was a useless study. I spent 6 months of my life designing, preparing, and executing the study, and it was trash. It was trash. Simply for that reason. I did not consider the analysis in the design phase. And then reflection too, what I want to make sure we talk about, we'll talk about this more in a subsequent lecture, is you have to remember that you can only reflect, or rather discuss or conclude things that are supported by the data. And it's easy to let your bias come in and make you interpret the data a certain way or look at it from a certain angle simply because you're choosing to do so, right? Subconsciously, usually. And if you're wondering why the heck the picture in the bottom right, essentially this is the elephant in the room. Bias and artifacts are always the elephant in the room, and you could choose to ignore it, but it will not be good. You need to deliberately address the elephant in the room. This way your research will come out accurate, reliable, and valid.